Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
A few weeks ago, about 2 weeks ago now, after our first Personality Hacker retreat we had about 6 people come in, clients and students come in to do some workshopping with us for a couple days in New Jersey. We were near New York City, and Nee on our team, our COO, had scheduled a meeting with a friend of ours in New York City on that Monday night. So the four of us, me and Antonia, Nee on our team, and our chief of staff, Charis, we all went up to New York City into Manhattan to have dinner. And we sat down to dinner. It was the four of us from the PH team and our friend who had come. And we sat down at this, this really cool Italian place in Manhattan. A lot of cool Italian places, but it was a good place. And we started to have a conversation together. And during the conversation, it was really interesting because at the table, Antonia and I are very chatty people, and we come at conversation in a very particular way for, how we're styled in conversation. And I noticed something happening during the dinner. Antonia and I ended up being combative with each other without it really being overt. We weren't really overt, but we were being combative in that we were both trying to wrestle the conversation onto our turf. And it was kind of a weird interchange to the point where after this, 2-hour dinner together was ended, we got a little bit of a tough, like a tough, is that a right word? Tussle? Tussle? That's the right word? Tussle? We got in this basically it was an argument, quite frankly. And it really didn't start out like in an argument frame. It was like, hey, that thing you did, blah, blah, blah. And it was like, wait, what? And then it started to just kind of devolve. You've had these arguments, right? If you're in a relationship, you know what these are like. It started off kind of well-intended, and then within 3 hours, we're like, and another thing, it wasn't like yelling or anything like that, but it was definitely like, we just couldn't come to agreement on the perspective we were seeing from this dinner. And so we, unfortunately, because who we are, we deconstruct things for like the next 2 weeks based on, okay, what went wrong? How did that happen? What was going on here? Why did we wrestle? Why were we trying to wrestle control at the dinner and the conversation? What was going on there? And we thought it came down to a couple things, potentially to Enneagram type and subtype, and obviously personality type, and then just our philosophy with how we approach conversation and that type of thing. So obviously our lives are the laboratory for this podcast. We thought we'd talk about some of the things that we took away from the experience we had that might be beneficial to you when you're thinking about how you approach conversation, how you approach conversation with other people that you're close to, and the dynamics that those all play together in.
Yeah, well, and after we recorded the podcast on how to be a good listener, we actually got quite a few requests on how to be a good conversationalist. Because for some people, they're really good listeners, but inserting themselves in a conversation is tough. And what's interesting is that when I said, well, we should record a podcast on being a good conversationalist, the first thing that came to both of our minds was a situation where we both thought that our style of conversation was the right one, and that ended up actually creating a little bit of heat, weirdly enough. And that sort of led to this idea that to be a good conversationalist is many varied. To be a good listener, you've got to have a couple skills, right? Like you have to be able to input, you have to be able to connect, you have to, we already recorded the podcast on being a good listener, but being a good conversationalist is actually a little tougher, because each person is going to be a good conversationalist in a different way, depending upon their personality type and depending upon the things that suit them. So as we fillet out this idea of being a good conversationalist, we don't have like bullet points here. On being a good listener, we actually had like bullet points. There are certain things you want to do to be a good listener. We don't have bullet points on conversationalists, but we do have our own story or own take on what it means to be a good conversationalist. And we hope that some of the principles we talk about will help you match up to what is your style of being a good conversationalist.
When I go into a conversation, I always assume I'm the host. And that might be, I think there's limitations to this, but when I'm talking to somebody, I always assume, number one, control of the conversation, not control like domineering control to tell somebody what they have to say back. But I guess I would take, instead of control, the better word would be leadership. Like I try to take the lead on the conversation, because I found that if I'm not taking the lead, often conversations stall and it can get awkward and it's kind of a weird thing. So if you ever come to a meetup, for example, and you meet me at a meetup, usually you'll be seeing me take the lead in conversing with you, because I I feel more comfortable that way if I'm taking the lead in the conversation. So I show up to conversations typically taking the lead and typically playing host or MC. So I think in terms of how do I make sure that not just me and the person I'm engaged with are having a good conversation, but if there's anybody else hanging on the wings, off to the side or something, they're included. And so, for example, at this particular dinner, I noticed that Charis was sitting over to your right. So me and our friend were sitting on one side of the table. You, Charis, and Nee were sitting on the other side of the table. And I could see her getting kind of bored maybe or like drifting off. And so I kept trying to like, hey, you doing cool? And I kept reaching out to bring her into the conversation because I'm looking at it from a framework of, and whether this is a good thing or not, I'm still evaluating this. I look at it as it's my responsibility to ensure that everybody that's in my sphere is having a good, interesting, and if I can get it, connective time with each other. So I'm not usually zoomed in on one person where I'm going like super deep with them, especially if there's a lot of other people. I want to ensure that everybody at the table is getting input. There's cross-pollination of ideas. Everybody gets to share something at least once or twice if they want to. And they're not just letting themselves kind of just drift off out of the conversation and sitting over the side being bored. I'm very attuned to that, which limits me from being able to surrender to the experience because I always got this little piece in the back of my head that I'm playing MC or host and I'm responsible, for good or bad, for everybody's experience, including my own.
And what do you think, based on what you know about your personality type, is informing that style of conversation?
I think my effectiveness as an ENFP in the Myers-Briggs system, in case you're a brand new listener, I have a tertiary or 10-year-old cognitive function called extroverted thinking. We've nicknamed it effectiveness. I think part of that is me architecting an external framework for good conversation to happen. So when I'm in an extroverted space, I'm using my extrovert intuition or exploration to think of quality topics, but then I'm also accounting for, it's almost like a stage, whatever framework I'm in. If it's a little group standing or a table, I tend to think in terms of this is a structural event almost. I see it as an event that I'm in charge of. I think so like my personality type in that contributes to it. And then my Enneagram type, I'm a 6 social. And so I very much am looking to keep the social framework going, the social dynamic. It's not about being intimate right now. Intimacy is for me and one other person later on to get really deep on a topic over in the corner. But it's a table of people. If I start to get really intimate or deep, that's going to cut off the social framework for everybody else. So I want to keep the social dynamic going. I want everybody to have a really good time now. And if there's a more intimate conversation, that can happen later offline, just 2 or 3 people off to the side.
I think ENFPs are also known to be performers most of the time. And so this is a little bit, I mean, if I was the audience member or the listener, I'd probably be thinking, but ENFPs aren't usually trying to control the situation, right? Or control the conversation in like a architected way. Aren't they usually trying to entertain and be a performer and kind of get everybody's attention and make sure everybody's interested by being the performer? So do you identify with that piece as well?
A little bit. I think I don't resonate with a lot of ENT or ENFP stereotypes, like the vomiting rainbows on the INTJ stereotype. Obviously, every type's expressed differently. I think, like, I'm not the kind of ENFP like the Russell Brand that wants all the attention on me all the time. In fact, often I will try to put the attention on somebody else to alleviate the attention being on me in a lot of ways. By asking questions and not even sharing much intimate details about myself, just making it all about the other person or persons in a conversation. So I don't really resonate. I know what you're talking about, and I know a lot of ENFPs are, and people that know ENFPs are going to have this experience of kind of I hate to use the word class clown, but the life of the party, the person that, oh, the person's here. It's fun time now. This person's here. They're going to make sure we're all having a good time, like from a performance, like almost a magnet of energy that just moves through a room, right? And I could turn that on if I wanted to. I think part of it too is my training. I grew up at a summer camp for years and grew up in a youth organization with my parents. And so most of the responsibilities I had as a teenager and young adult were hosting experiences for other people. So I was in charge, for example, of at our summer camp running the evening program meetings, which was a lot of music and skits and, variety type things. And then there's a speaker, and I would be in charge of coordinating all this and emceeing the entire experience for everybody from the stage and ensuring that the audience had a good experience from it. You can see that show up here in the podcast. I typically do most of the framing because that's my background, right? The framing piece. And I think it's just, so some of it's my experience, some of it's just how I'm wired as an ENFP. And then I think I have again, for better or worse, and I can talk about this too, I overvalue my responsibility for the people in my sphere at all times, to the point where, you listening, I feel responsible for you to have a good experience with this podcast. And if you ever come and get one of our premium programs and products, we have an internal debate here at Personality Hacker all the time. I'm like, I'll tell our team, it's our responsibility to make sure that people get what they need and implement this. And it's not a healthy necessarily experience of it. I think I tend to take messages that are for other people to apply to their lives, and I take them too serious, and I sometimes make rules about them that are like way too far on the one side. Like I feel like I am 100% responsible for everything that happens in my life. 100% responsible. So if I park my car on a street in front of a store and it gets hit by another car, I'm like, well, that's my responsibility because I parked it there. Like, I mean, that's the philosophy I kind of like live my life by. I know that's not accurate. I know I'm not 100% responsible for everything in my life, but I've noticed that if I live my life that way, I tend to feel more empowered than if I don't. I don't feel like things are happening to me. I feel like, well, that's how this happened, good and bad. So this overreach of everybody that I'm responsible for in a conversation, I know I could probably work on the health of that. And that's what emerged from some of our convos after the quote unquote convos after the that evening at the dinner.
Yeah, you absolutely have a host mentality. You are really good at framing things. And it's one of the reasons why you start the podcast out, right? You always started out, hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt. And then I chime in with, I'm Antonia Dodge. And I think the reason why is because you've trained yourself to bring an MC energy to everything. And so you've got that host mentality. You've got that MC mentality. And so I've noticed that in conversations, you very much turn it into kind of like it's your job to sort of MC the relationships that are happening, or MC the conversation. And I think what's interesting about that is, you don't perform maybe like other ENFPs do, right? Like you don't, because I think ENFPs in general kind of feel a sense that they're responsible for entertaining people. I think that's why a lot of them turn into performers, because it's their job to make sure everybody's having a good time. I don't know if that's 100%, but I don't think that that's uncommon. And so a lot of times they favor the performance. If everybody's looking at me and I'm entertaining, then everybody's entertained, right? Are you not entertained? And I think what you did is, because of your life circumstances and your situation, it turned into you developing MC skills, which made it so that not everything's paying attention to you, but you're able to highlight the interesting things that are going on, right? Because that's what an MC does. They introduce something else that's interesting. And so if you notice people's attention, and a part of an MC's job is to notice when people's attention is starting to sort of drift someplace else. You as an MC, as a trained MC, notice when people's, attention is drifting, and you are good at bringing the attention back. And so that's how you've chosen to converse in group settings. What about one-on-one? What's your conversation style when you're just talking to one person?
It's evolved. So it used to be a FBI interrogation where I had a metaphoric bright light in the other person's face, and I would just grill them on topic after topic and experience of their lives. Because I learned early on that if you talk about somebody else and you ask them questions about themselves, they'll go away from that interchange going, man, you're such a great conversationalist. You are so interesting. You didn't say anything about yourself. And they'll think you're the most interesting person on the planet just because you listened to them and you not only listened, but led the conversation to the things they're interested in. And I'm genuinely interested in like 90% of all things. Like there's probably 10% that I will not be able to find any interest in, but even then I can probably find a way to connect it to something I'm interested in somehow. So you could drop me next to somebody and it's 9 times out of 10 or 99 times out of 100, I'll be able to have a conversation with that person and legitimately, not just placating them, but legitimately figure out something new or learn something or have a really great experience in that conversation. If I'm in the lead, that's a caveat, because that's something that I don't necessarily think other people are able to meet me on my terms as well as I can meet them on theirs. And maybe that's arrogant for me to say, but that's just how I believe this. So I'm getting better. I used to be more like an FBI interrogator, Now I'm doing a lot more pausing and giving more space to conversation. I also learned that instead of asking a lot of questions, I should posit ideas, which creates more intimacy. So instead of just question, I seed an idea out there like, well, I think that, that XYZ, and then just pause and let the person calibrate against that statement. And that's been a shift in me that's gotten much richer conversations emerging from it, because now people can take an idea and expand upon it rather than answering a question. Because often people, when you ask them questions, sometimes they can feel like they're a little insecure, like, whoa, I'm giving too much information. But if it's an idea exchange, it can keep the conversation a little bit more interesting. So I've evolved over the years, and in the recent years particularly. So that's kind of how I approach the personal thing.
Yeah, I find it interesting. Of all things around type, I think being an ENFP is definitely going to inform your conversational style. But I think as an ENTP, because I'm a pretty similar personality type, obviously different enough to have very distinctive takes on reality, but similar enough so that I kind of feel, I kind of vibe with that, right? Like, yeah, my conversational style to some extent is to make sure everybody's entertained. I want to make sure things are as interesting as possible. And so I have a tendency to feel a sense of responsibility that everything, like the conversation, keeps going at a good clip and has a good rhythm. But I think the bigger difference I can see between the two of us is that you are a social subtype. So when you converse, you go wide, right? It's the most amount of people in the room that are having a vibing experience with each other. So you see yourself almost like an orchestra conductor. Like that MC nature turns you into an orchestra conductor of all of the people in the room. And so when you talk to people, you naturally talk to a lot of people at the same time. And I've also seen you ask questions of somebody in behalf of somebody else, almost like, hey, so that person was asking about blah, 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 blah. Hey, you over there, what would you say to that person if they asked you that question? Almost like asking it for them by proxy.
Yeah, all the time.
And so it's like, so now these two people are in a conversation with each other as sort of a medium between the two of them. And then now you've paired them up and matched them. So it's a really sort of fascinating dynamic that I've observed you do. I, on the other hand, am a sexual subtype, which means I'm 1-to-1. And so I very naturally go towards intimate conversation and 1-to-1 conversation. And I've actually had to become a better social conversationalist. I'm actually really bad in a group. I'm not that great because especially if I feel the burden of kind of keeping the conversation going. This happens at meetups. And it's like I've observed that I've had to work through some of this awkwardness, that a group of people at one of our meetups will be talking and I'll walk up to them and then I just kill the conversation with my presence. I think a part of it is because they're there to talk to me and talk to you. And so we are sort of the hosts of the situation, or the quote unquote stars of the show. And so I walk up and then people will look at me like expecting me to say something. And I'm like, oh crap, I've got like 5 people looking at me expectantly. If it was just one person, I would know immediately what to do. But because there's 5 people looking at me and blinking, I'm like, oh, okay. So maybe I need to up my social game in this context. If I walk up to just one person, I'm great. And a part of it is because I think each individual person, I have a belief that even if you're not a sexual subtype, even if the sexual subtype is maybe your blind spot in the Enneagram subtypes or in their instincts, I think that everybody is relieved to go deep. Everybody really wants to connect with another person. And the only times we withhold that is because we're afraid of letting the other person in, and we don't trust that they'll be respectful once they get in. And so what I do when I engage with people conversationally 1-to-1 is I just start working on projecting positive intent. I just I start sharing. I start sharing things about me, like the intimate things that most people withhold. I just start sharing them myself so that the person knows, well, I took the initiative on doing this. So if you are also transparent back or share back, I'm going to honor and respect that because I've already trusted it with you. I recently heard somebody say, I trust people who trust me. And I'm like, I bet that's most people. And so if I initiate the trust, I initiate that I trust them by letting them in on something that might be embarrassing or might be, easy to judge or something that is vulnerable, then generally the other person will oftentimes, not 100% of the time, but oftentimes respond in kind. That said, if I'm in a social context where there's many people and they're talking, I think one of the things that I do very well in a social setting where there's like a group of people talking is I'm very good at penetrating the shallow. So the challenge a lot of people have is taking it from a small talk place into a quality conversation. And I think in social contexts, when there's a group, the thing that I have learned to do very well is take people to the place that they really want to go. Most people do not want to be talking small talk. It's a social dance that everybody's got to do just to, to sniff each other's butts and make sure that everybody's got good juju or something. And usually what I'll do is I'll wait until the small talk winds down, which it almost always does, right? There's always like a law of diminishing returns on small talk, and the conversation will sort of wind down. And then most people will kick it back up with another piece of small talk. They'll after the weather's done, then they'll talk about sports. And after sports are done, they'll talk about, where are you from or whatever, right? How is business going? And I have learned a technique that when it winds down before somebody else can, I let it sort of pause for a beat. And before somebody else can wind it back up, struggling to figure out another topic, I'll say something like, so I'm about to offend everyone here. I'll just say something like that, which is very much my introverted thinking or accuracy co-pilot thing to do, which is just say something that is radically honest. And it isn't necessarily radically honest, but it sounds like it is. Sometimes I'm being very, very radically honest. I'm about to say something that could offend somebody in this room. Or I'll say something like, so I have a potentially controversial topic. And oh my gosh, everybody I think they're so relieved to not be talking small talk. Everybody's like, what? And then I'll throw something abstract out. And I'll throw something that's true for me, something that could be potentially controversial, but isn't known, isn't a powder cake. I won't necessarily bring up politics, but I will bring up something like, so what do you guys think about the current perspective on gender, right? Which is something that everybody kind of is talking about right now and has a lot of different perspectives and, has a lot of different sort of it's a wide enough and broad enough topic where somebody else can grab it and take it, right? And that oftentimes is what happens. I'll say something that is potentially controversial but has enough sort of angles and on-ramps that a person can take it in a different direction. And so now we're talking about something real. Or I'll pick a different topic that is, sort of context appropriate. But I've noticed that it's one of the ways to take a conversation from a place that nobody wants to be, which is the shallows, into a place where everybody wants to be, which is deep. The challenge is making sure that people are, at that point, I guess I feel kind of responsible to make sure that we don't go to a place where people are now fighting. And if you are surrounded by people who are ready to get into sort of conversational fisticuffs, then the controversial thing that a person could say, when I choose those, I usually don't choose them to be intentionally antagonistic. Maybe even a conversation around, what do you guys think about the current conversation on gender might be a little too much. Maybe it would be something more like an abstraction, like how much transparency is too much transparency, which is a relatively safe topic, but it still allows people to think about something that's a little deeper. Or something like, how do you think growing up with social media is going to alter people's relationship, to reality or something to that effect? But I think that as a sexual subtype, that has become that's the easiest way for me to be a good conversationalist, is to recognize that people want depth and I don't fear that depth. I think for you as a social subtype, it's been that you know that people want to be entertained and usually led conversationally, and you don't fear doing that. Whereas I don't like taking control of a conversation. I don't mind positing a topic, but I don't usually like to orchestrate it. And that was in our conversation that one evening, that was actually our challenge, was that I kept wanting to take the conversation to a more intimate, deeper place. And you were more trying to make sure that everybody at the table was being represented and felt like that they were interested and they were being entertained. And so then we had sort of this I guess I was trying to control the conversation to some extent. Like we had...
Yeah, that's why I was frustrated with you.
Yeah. Well, we had a cross purposes there. And I think a part of that was because the person who we went out to dinner with was an old friend of mine who I've known for like a decade. And so I felt more liberty to be able to have an intimate, conversation. But not everybody at the table had the same relationship, right? We hadn't all been friends for a decade. So I immediately went into that sexual one-to-one intimacy frame, and you immediately went into the MC frame, and then we found ourselves at sort of locking horns. And we even talked about it later when we did our 2 weeks of perpetual deconstruction, which is of course what we always do. And we were listening to the Joe Rogan podcast, the Joe Rogan Experience, right? That's what it is. The Joe Rogan Experience podcast. And that guy's got to be a self-preservation subtype, because all he talks about is things that can kill you. I've noticed. And he had...
all his fears.
Yeah, all his fears all the time. And I noticed when he had Bill Burr on, the comedian Bill Burr, who also has to be a self-preservation subtype. I could be wrong, but my goodness. The two of them, it was interesting to hear the conversation because they both kept the conversation going very well. And mostly what they talked about are things that terrify them or things that can get you killed. And I'm like, that's fascinating. So I think, again, looking at it in terms of being a good conversationalist, I don't think that there are like specific things that you need to do necessarily, other than honor what's natural for you and to figure out techniques that will highlight what you do best.
I think that's really the point, is not everyone's going to approach conversation the same way. You're going to have different Enneagram types, different personality types. We didn't even really go into the whole introvert-extrovert thing. But if you think about, if you're an introvert listening, you're like, yeah, you guys are extroverts. It's easy for you to talk to people. I struggle with even like opening up at all. Like, I'm not even at the place of social, sexual, self-pres. Like I just have a hard time knowing how to interface with people. Maybe you're an INTP listening and you don't exactly know. You might even be able to talk a lot, but there's all these social rules put on you. So it's not even that you're shy. It's just that you tend to get punished socially for opening up, and you're like, what am I doing wrong? Or maybe you are just another introvert type. I picked on INTPs because that's the stereotype, right? But I know a lot of INTPs that are great conversationalists. It's one of those things you think about if you're an introvert, like, how do I do this? And I think the thing for you is maybe the access point is the listening piece. Maybe it's you being that great listener, allowing the other person to talk is the starting point for you in conversation. And then you could figure out ways to, bring in the Enneagram subtype maybe that you are. I would encourage people, because I think basically what I think has happened is we all have a landing space for conversation. I think we all have something we're comfortable with. I don't care if you're an introvert, extrovert. I don't care what your personality type is, Enneagram or Myers-Briggs or anything else. I think we all have strategies that we've fallen back on in our lives. And one of the things that I'm taking away from this conversation is some of the things I've been reflecting upon in conversation, like how to be a good conversationalist, is, I come from that MC frame of, containing the conversation, sometimes controlling it or at least leading it and having that go the way I'd like to direct it. And I'm trying to work, like I said, on just being present, getting more into my secondary Enneagram sexual subtype, and just allowing that intimate piece to be there, more and more. And I would encourage that for you. I bet you have a strategy that you rely upon in most interactions that could be grown in your conversation. I think that's really the key message from this, is where is the access point for you to grow yourself as a conversationalist beyond just the default setting in your own life.
Yeah, well, and if you look at instincts like as a stack, which I think we've talked about that a little bit in previous podcasts, with those 3 Enneagram instincts of social, sexual, and self-preservation. I'm social last. That's my blind spot. And so because I'm social dead last, I'm sometimes pretty clumsy at understanding, sort of like in the context that we were talking about, if other people are, like I don't want anybody to be bored, but if other people are bored, I might not be as tuned into that. I might be kind of assuming that that's their problem to handle. I want people to be interested and entertained, but I don't have that sense of responsibility that you do. And so I go, well, if they're bored, I guess that's their problem because I'm being interesting. And so I think for me, recognizing what my conversational blind spot is there in a social context gives me a lot to work on. It gives me a lot of like, well, maybe I should be more in touch. Maybe I should be paying attention more to other people and their responses. And so I think that's the other piece of being a good conversationalist. I mean, again, I don't have like a specific, like this isn't a listicle. This is not like big on conversationalist, point number one. It's more sort of a conversation about conversation. And I think for me, what I'm taking away and sort of what's becoming more and more obvious to me is that that piece of the blind spot is probably impacting how I talk to others and creating awkward moments or creating less ideal situations for others. And so I'm going to try to have my feelers out for that a little bit more. I'm going to try to be a little bit more aware.
Yeah, I don't think you would ever, I don't think that that's as big of an issue as you think it is, but I think I can appreciate what you're talking about. If you're a sexual subtype or one-to-one listening, I don't think you don't necessarily don't have other people's, energies on your radar. I think you do a really good job of that, Antonia. And we've talked about this in the podcast too before. I think the two of us in relationship tend to work well together in that, you can, I'm a little envious of it sometimes, the depth that you can go to with somebody on. I'm always like, she's creating such intimate, connective relationships, and I have a lot more surface. But what's great about it is I think both of us get to benefit from the other's strength in our relationship. And in the conversations we end up having here, obviously with you on the podcast, right? Because you're listening with us. And in, meetup situations or everything through life, it's cool because I kind of I'm going like wide and outward and you're going deep and downward in a way. And the two of us doing that together as a 1-2 punch is powerful. And it really, I think it enriches our lives. So you're not only going to be a conversation on your own right, but the person maybe you're in relationship with, your partner, maybe a friend or a coworker or your parent or child, in a dynamic with them. And now you're not just being a conversation with yourself, but you also are interplaying with somebody else in a way. And I think that can be really powerful and cool to see that emerge as well.
Well, and as with anything, it's like practice, right? And when you fail, kind of like our context allowed us to see what we weren't doing right. And then, are obsessing over it and micro, like just tearing it apart. Helped us go, okay, so this is something I'm not as aware of. And so allowing yourself after a moment, because I think the other thing about conversation is that when it is awkward, I think we go away feeling kind of icky, right? Like we should have done better, but we don't always take the time to deconstruct it. And what's nice about having some of these models as tools is we can use them as a framework or as a lens to start figuring out what are our blind spots, why maybe it didn't go as well. Like as an intuitive, I also find myself, I made the recommendation, ask questions like, well, how will living amongst a world of social media your entire life alter how we, younger people experience reality? That might be a very intuitive question that sensors might not find very interesting. I actually have found that sensors find that question very interesting because it's very relevant to them. But I might have something that's a similar style of question that just lands really flat. And so leaving going, man, I really failed there. I really didn't do a good job is maybe not the right lesson to take. Maybe the lesson I need to take is understand my audience better and meet them where they're at. So I think that's the other thing about being a good conversationalist is that if you don't, succeed in some of these contexts, taking the right lessons, right? Like not just assuming you did something bad or wrong, but going, well, maybe in that situation, I was the only sexual subtype that wanted to go deep and everybody else wanted to have more of like a fun vibe. And so I wasn't wrong necessarily, but it just, I was trying to make something happen that wasn't appropriate for the situation. And so like recognizing that it's a rhythm. conversation is a rhythm, and kind of figuring out how you tend to play the instrument of conversation, and then becoming more versatile overall.
I could see us exploring this topic in the future. In fact, we probably, after this podcast, will get you writing in or sharing your story, and we're going to get a bunch of nuances and insights, especially if you're an introvert, because, that's not our experience. We're very extroverted, and we get on a microphone every week and talk with you. But you might have an experience very different than ours, and maybe there's things you've learned. Maybe there's insights you have. There's stories you could tell to us and the rest of the community. We would love to hear from you. I think your story is important. So if you come over to personalityhacker.com, and under this podcast, there's an area for comments to leave your story, ask questions, make contributions to the community around these topics, an online quote unquote conversation, if you will. I think that would be really valuable for your voice to be included. So come over to personalityhacker.com or you can also join our community of like-minded people that think similar to you, but maybe have some different perspectives, but they're usually interested in personal growth and figuring out ways to be a better human on this planet and interface with the people in our lives in a better way. And you can find that community over at facebook.com/personalityhacker and also twitter.com/personalityhack.
If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And I usually ask people if they want to be generous, they can leave us a rating review on iTunes. But I just want to remind people that we have our book out, Personality Hacker. You can look for it online on Amazon and other retailers. And if you want to leave a rating and review, you enjoyed the book, you can leave a rating and review for the book on Amazon. That would help us out a lot.
That'd be great. And for the podcast too.
Yeah, why not? And
be sure to subscribe if you're a new listener. I want to meet you again, same time, same channel next week. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we will talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.